My husband died 5 years ago and left me nothing but debts. But a month later, a banker called me. Your husband opened an account in 1978 and kept adding to it for 40 years while he was alive. When they told me the balance that belonged to me, I couldn't believe it. Good day, dear listeners. It's Clara again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please like this video and listen to my story till the end and let me know which city you're listening from. That way, I can see how far my story has traveled. I used to think I knew my husband. 41 years of marriage will do that to you. 41 years of coffee at the same kitchen table, of arguing over the thermostat in winter, of watching him fall asleep in front of the evening news before 10 o'clock. You start to believe you've mapped every corner of a person. You start to believe there are no rooms left you haven't entered. His name was Robert Harlow. Bob, to everyone who loved him. He was a civil engineer from Cincinnati, Ohio, a quiet man with large hands and a habit of humming old Sinatra tunes while he washed the dishes. We met in 1981 at a church potluck in Hyde Park. He brought a terrible green bean casserole, and I told him so to his face. He laughed so hard, he spilled sweet tea on his collar. 3 months later, he proposed on the banks of the Ohio River, and I said yes before he'd even finished the sentence. Life wasn't glamorous. It wasn't supposed to be. We raised our son, Danny, in a brick colonial on Westover Hills Boulevard. Bob worked long hours. I taught 3rd grade for 22 years, then retired to take care of his mother when she got sick. We took vacations to Gatlinburg and Myrtle Beach. We refinanced the house twice. We fought about money the way most middle-class couples do, quietly and with great exhaustion. When Bob died of a heart attack in March of 2019, I thought the hardest part would be the loneliness. I was wrong. The hardest part was the paperwork. Within 6 weeks of his funeral, I was sitting at our kitchen table, the same table where we'd shared 40 years of coffee, surrounded by statements and overdue notices I had never seen before. A second mortgage on the house I didn't know existed. A line of credit opened in 2016. Medical bills, yes, but also something vaguer. Transfers, withdrawals, accounts I couldn't trace. My name was on almost none of them. I remember my hands shaking as I sorted through the files. Danny sat across from me, his face pale, saying very little. He was 34 years old, and he looked like a boy who'd just been told Santa Claus wasn't real. The debt, when I finally added it up, came to just over $190,000. I told myself there was an explanation. Bob had been sick for 2 years before he died. The cardiac episodes, the medications, the specialist visits in Columbus. Medical debt was not unusual. Financial disorganization was not unusual. I told myself I simply hadn't paid close enough attention. But there had been signs, hadn't there? The phone calls Bob used to take in the garage. The way he'd close his laptop when I walked into the room, slowly, with the particular casualness of someone trying not to look like they were hiding something. The Christmas of 2017, when his daughter Diane drove up from Louisville with her mother Barbara, his first wife, for what she called a family check-in, which I had always found strange since Bob and Barbara had been divorced since 1979. Diane was 47 years old and worked in real estate. She had her mother's eyes and her father's stubbornness, and she had never, in 20 years of knowing me, called me anything but Margaret, despite the fact that everyone else in my life called me Peggy. It was a small thing. I used to tell myself it was a small thing. But small things have a way of adding up. After Bob's death, Diane arrived at the house before the reception was even over. She went through his study, I assumed to collect personal items. She was polite. She was efficient. She took 2 cardboard boxes and left within the hour. I didn't think to ask what was in them. That was my first mistake. The second was trusting that the estate had been settled honestly. I didn't hire my own attorney. I relied on the family's longtime lawyer, Gerald Pruitt, who had known Bob for 30 years and who explained everything to me in a tone that suggested I wouldn't understand the details anyway. I signed what he put in front of me. I took the pen and I signed. And then I spent 5 years paying down a dead man's debts, selling off what I could, living on my teacher's pension and what little Social Security covered, wondering what I had done wrong. 5 years. Until the Tuesday morning in April when my phone rang, and an unfamiliar voice said, "Mrs. Harlow, my name is Thomas Vale. I'm a senior accounts manager at First Fidelity Trust. I'm calling about an account held in your husband's name, yours as well as co-beneficiary. It was opened in 1978, and I believe you may not be aware it exists." I sat down on the kitchen floor. I hadn't even made it to a chair. I stayed on that kitchen floor for a long time. I don't know exactly how long. Long enough for the coffee I'd left on the counter to go cold. Long enough for the morning light to shift from pale gold to flat white through the kitchen curtains. I held the phone in my lap and I stared at the linoleum, and I tried to make sense of what Thomas Vale had just told me. He'd been careful on the call, measured, professional. He said he couldn't discuss account specifics over the phone. Privacy protocols, he explained, required that I come into the branch and present identification. He gave me an address on 5th Street, downtown. He said someone would be available Thursday morning at 10. He asked if that worked for me. I said yes. I said it before I had processed a single word he'd spoken. After I hung up, I sat at the kitchen table with a legal pad and wrote down everything he'd told me, word by word, the way I used to take notes in a faculty meeting. It helped me think. It had always helped me think. Account opened in 1978. Co-beneficiary. First Fidelity Trust. Bob and I didn't meet until 1981, which meant this account, whatever it was, predated our marriage, and yet my name was on it. He had added me at some point, quietly, without ever mentioning it. Why? I turned that question over in my mind for the rest of Tuesday and all of Wednesday. I cleaned the house because I needed something to do with my hands. I reorganized the linen closet. I walked the 2 blocks to the park and sat on a bench near the duck pond and watched a young woman push a stroller in slow, patient circles. And I thought about all the conversations Bob and I had never had. We had talked about everything. That was what I always said at dinner parties in those early years. Bob and I talk about everything. We disagreed about politics, about child rearing, about whether it was acceptable to refrigerate tomatoes. We had argued and reconciled and argued again for 4 decades. I had believed, sincerely believed, that there was an honesty between us. But what is honesty in a marriage, really? Is it the absence of lies? Or is it something more active? The willingness to hand another person every key you own, including the ones to rooms you'd rather keep locked? I went home and made myself eat dinner. Soup from a can. I sat at the table alone, the way I had every evening for 5 years, and I thought about Diane. That was when the shape of something began to form in my mind. Diane had come to the house the day of the funeral and taken 2 boxes from Bob's study. I had never asked what was in them. I had never thought to ask. But now I thought of other things. Small details I had filed away without examining. The way she'd insisted on handling all communication with Gerald Pruitt during the estate process, acting as the point of contact to spare me the stress. The way she had summarized the estate documents for me, rather than walking me through them line by line. The way she had stood in my kitchen 2 months after the funeral and said, gently, that I should probably think about downsizing, that the house payments were going to be challenging going forward. She had known about the debt. Had she also known about the account? I didn't sleep that night. I lay in the bed I had shared with Bob for 37 years, and I stared at the ceiling, and I made a list in my head. Not of what I knew, but of what I needed to find out. Thursday morning, I was at First Fidelity Trust on 5th Street by 9:40. I sat in a chair in the lobby and waited. The branch was cool and quiet, the way banks always are, as if money prefers a certain temperature. A young woman at the front desk brought me water without my asking. Thomas Vale was exactly what his voice had suggested. A man in his late 50s, gray at the temples, careful in his movements. He shook my hand and led me to a glass-walled office near the back and closed the door. He told me the balance. I won't share the exact figure here, not yet, but I will tell you this. It was more than I had earned in 30 years of teaching. It was more than the debt. It was more than the house. It was, by any measure I had available to me, a life-changing sum. I kept my face very still. I had learned, in 5 years of navigating grief and financial ruin, that the moment you show someone how much something matters, you give them power over you. "I'll need documentation," I said. "Everything you have." Thomas nodded as though he had expected this. He slid a folder across the desk. On the drive home, I stopped at a Walgreens and bought a new legal pad, a box of manila folders, and a set of colored pens. Then I went home and I began to plan. The first thing I did was find a lawyer who had never heard of Gerald Pruitt. I didn't want a referral from anyone in Bob's circle. I didn't want someone who played golf with someone who once had lunch with someone who knew Diane. I wanted a stranger, someone whose only loyalty was to the facts and to me. I found her through the Ohio State Bar Association's online directory. Her name was Carol Simmons. She had 23 years of experience in estate law and elder financial abuse litigation, and her office was in Blue Ash, far enough from Hyde Park that I was unlikely to run into anyone I knew in the parking lot. Her assistant gave me an appointment for the following Monday. That weekend, I sat at the kitchen table with my new legal pad and went through everything I had: the estate documents I had signed, the account documentation from Thomas Vale, the debt records I had been living with for 5 years. I made a timeline. I cross-referenced dates. I wrote down every conversation with Diane that I could remember, noting what she had said and, more importantly, what she had specifically steered me away from asking. The pattern was not subtle once I was looking for it. Carol Simmons was a small woman with silver-streaked hair and reading glasses she wore on a chain around her neck. She had the calm, systematic energy of someone who spent her professional life sorting through other people's worst surprises. She listened to me for 40 minutes without interrupting. Then she put on her glasses and read through the documents I had brought. "The co-beneficiary designation was added in 1989, she said, looking at the First Fidelity paperwork. "Did your husband ever mention that to you?" "Never." "And the estate was settled through Gerald Pruitt?" "Yes." "Did Pruitt have access to your husband's full financial records?" I told her I assumed so. She wrote something on her notepad and said nothing for a moment. "Mrs. Harlow," she said finally, "if this account existed at the time of your husband's death and was not disclosed during probate, that is a serious problem. It may constitute fraud against the estate. Depending on what we find, it could involve your husband's attorney, his daughter, or both." The word fraud sat in the air between us like a stone dropped into still water. I drove home through the April afternoon thinking about Gerald Pruitt, his measured explanations, his patient sighs, his habit of addressing me as if I were a child being told why she couldn't have dessert before dinner. Had he simply been negligent? Or had he been deliberate? I didn't have to wait long for an answer. Carol called me that Wednesday. She had submitted a formal records request to First Fidelity Trust, and Thomas Vale had been cooperative. What emerged from the documentation was this. 18 months before Bob's death, in September of 2017, someone had submitted a written inquiry to the bank asking about the process for removing a co-beneficiary from an account. The inquiry had been submitted on behalf of Robert Harlow, but the handwriting on the original letter was not Bob's. Thomas Vale had kept the original because something about it had struck him as irregular at the time, and he had never filed it away properly. It had sat in a physical folder in his desk drawer for years, which was how it had survived. He couldn't say legally what it meant, but he had made a copy for Carol. Carol sent me a scan that evening. I sat at my kitchen table and I looked at the handwriting on the letter, and I recognized it immediately. I had seen that handwriting on birthday cards, on casserole dishes returned with thank you notes, on a Christmas card that said, "Wishing you a peaceful season." Margaret in large looping letters that pressed hard into the paper. It was Diane's handwriting. In September of 2017, while Bob was alive but weakening, while I was managing his medications and driving him to appointments in Columbus, his daughter had written to his bank, using his name, asking how to cut me out of an account she was not supposed to know existed. She had known about the account for at least 2 years before he died. She had tried to remove me. She had failed. The bank had required Bob to appear in person for any beneficiary changes, and Bob, whether out of reluctance or declining health, had never done so. And then he had died. And Gerald Pruitt had guided me through an estate settlement that never once mentioned First Fidelity Trust. How much had Pruitt known? How many conversations had there been between Diane and Barbara and a family attorney about what to do with the wife who had signed whatever they put in front of her? I closed my laptop and sat in the dark kitchen for a long time. Then I picked up the phone and called Carol Simmons. "I'm ready," I said. "Tell me what we do next." Carol filed the complaint on a Thursday. It was a civil action naming Diane Harlow Cross and Gerald Pruitt as respondents in a claim of fraudulent concealment of estate assets. It cited the First Fidelity Trust account, the unauthorized letter submitted in Bob's name, and Pruitt's failure to disclose the account during probate proceedings. Carol had also filed a separate complaint with the Ohio Supreme Court's Board of Professional Conduct regarding Pruitt's conduct as an attorney. She told me it would take time. These things always took time. But the filing itself was a declaration. It put names on paper in an official record where they could not be quietly undone. I felt when she told me it was done something I hadn't expected. Not triumph, not relief. Something quieter. A sense of having finally stood in the correct place. I went to Grater's Ice Cream on Madison Road that afternoon and got a single scoop of black raspberry chip, the kind I always used to get when I was treating myself, and I sat at a table by the window and watched the afternoon foot traffic on the street and thought, this is what it feels like to stop being afraid. It lasted approximately 4 days. The call came on a Monday morning. It was Diane. She didn't raise her voice at first. That wasn't her style. She was cool and deliberate, and she said she had been made aware of my legal actions and that she wanted to discuss them. She used the word discuss the way a cat uses its paw before it extends its claws. I told her there was nothing to discuss. She could speak to my attorney. That was when the temperature changed. Margaret. Her voice dropped in a way I associated with her father. That quiet flattening that meant the pleasant portion of the conversation was over. You need to think very carefully about what you are doing. You are 65 years old. You are alone. You have a son who has a career and a family and a reputation in this city. Do you really want to spend the next 3 years of your life in a courtroom? She paused to let that settle. My father loved you, she said. But he also trusted us to handle certain things. This account is complicated. There are things you don't understand about where that money came from and what it was meant for. You could walk away from this with something reasonable, a settlement, something quiet, and everyone keeps their dignity. I thought about the word dignity. I thought about 5 years of eating soup from cans while making minimum payments on a mortgage I hadn't known existed. "I appreciate the call, Diane," I said. "Carol Simmons will be in touch." I hung up. She called back 4 minutes later from a different number. I let it go to voicemail. The message was from Barbara, Bob's first wife, Diane's mother, and it was considerably less composed. Barbara's voice was sharp and slightly breathless, and she said that I had always been an outsider in this family, that Bob had confided in them about his finances because he knew I couldn't be trusted to handle complexity, and that I was making a terrible mistake that I would regret for the rest of my life. I saved the voicemail. Then I forwarded it to Carol. 2 days later, Diane appeared at my door. She stood on my front porch in a cream-colored blazer, her hair pulled back, looking polished and calm in the way of someone who has practiced calm. She had brought nothing. She simply stood there. "I'm not going to stop," I said, through the half-open door. "I'm not asking you to stop," she said. "I'm asking you to listen. I've heard what you have to say. My answer is the same." Something moved across her face. Not anger exactly, but the shadow of it, the place where composure breaks just at the edges. "You have no idea," she said quietly, "what you are opening." "Then I suppose I'll find out." I closed the door. I stood in my hallway with my heart going fast and uneven in my chest, and I listened to her footsteps cross the porch, descend the steps, and recede down the front walk. Then I went upstairs, drew the curtains, and lay down on my bed in the afternoon light. I slept for 3 hours, the first real sleep I'd had in weeks. I gave myself 4 days. I watched old movies, took long walks around the duck pond, had dinner with Danny, who knew only that I was dealing with some estate things, and who asked careful, non-invasive questions in the way of a son who loves his mother and knows her well enough not to push. On the 5th day, I went back to Carol's office. I was ready to continue. Diane's next move surprised me with its elegance. I had expected escalation. More calls, more pressure, perhaps a letter from whatever attorney she had retained. Instead, 10 days after she had stood on my porch, I received a handwritten card in the mail. Cream envelope, her handwriting. That same large looping script I had seen on the letter to First Fidelity. The note inside said that she had spoken to her mother and that they wanted to meet, not as adversaries, but as family. She suggested lunch at the Precinct, a restaurant on Columbia Parkway that Bob had loved, that I had loved. She said she had something she wanted to share with me, a peace offering, or something dressed as one. I held the card for a long time. What was she offering exactly? A settlement number she thought I'd accept? Information she thought would change my position? Or simply an opportunity to look me in the face, assess how frightened I was, and calibrate her strategy accordingly? I didn't go to the lunch, but I didn't ignore the card either. I photographed it and sent it to Carol, and I wrote back, a single short paragraph, saying that I would not meet outside the presence of my attorney and that any offers should be directed through official channels. Diane did not respond. For 2 weeks, there was silence. It had the particular quality of silence that isn't quiet at all. The kind where you become more, not less, alert. I found myself checking my mailbox with something like dread, watching for unfamiliar cars on the street, going over conversations in my mind and wondering what I might have missed. I knew what I needed. I had lived alone long enough to recognize the signs. I was starting to fold inward, starting to make decisions from a place of fear rather than clarity. I needed someone to talk to. I thought about this for several days before I did anything. I was a private person, had been for most of my life. The years of teaching had given me the performance of confidence, but I had never been someone who asked easily for help. Bob had known this about me. He used to say that I treated vulnerability the way some people treat bad weather. I acknowledged it, dressed appropriately, and went outside anyway. I called my friend Ruth. Ruth Calloway had been my closest friend since 1993, when our sons had played on the same Little League team, and we had spent 2 seasons sitting together on aluminum bleachers, making fun of the parents who screamed at 8-year-olds about their batting stance. She was 71 now, sharp and funny and allergic to nonsense, a retired nurse who had buried one husband and divorced another, and who had a way of listening that made you feel both understood and slightly embarrassed you hadn't figured things out sooner. We met at a coffee shop in Oakley on a Thursday morning. I told her everything. Ruth did not say much while I talked. She stirred her coffee and watched my face and let me get through all of it. The account, the letter in Diane's handwriting, the estate, the debts, the years of quiet diminishment. When I finished, she put her mug down and said, "How long have you known? About the account? About 6 weeks?" "No," she said. "How long have you known something was wrong?" I opened my mouth to answer and found I didn't have one ready. "Because I remember," Ruth said, "the Christmas of 2018. You called me after the holidays and you said something about Diane and Bob and you used the word strange. And then you said, 'But I'm probably imagining it,' and changed the subject. I let you change it. I shouldn't have." I thought about that Christmas. Bob had been weaker by then. He had spent most of it in the armchair by the window. Diane had visited alone. Barbara had not come that year. And she and Bob had sat in his study for almost 2 hours with the door closed. I had told myself they were talking about his will, about family matters, the things a father and daughter needed to settle privately. Had she been pressing him then? Had she been trying again to remove my name? Ruth reached across the table and put her hand over mine. "You are not imagining anything now," she said, "and you are not alone in this." I didn't cry. I had done most of my crying in the first years after Bob died, and I had come out the other side of it with something harder and quieter, where the grief used to be. But I felt something loosen in my chest. Some knot I had been carrying so long I had forgotten it was there. I drove home through the spring afternoon, the windows down, the air smelling of cut grass and rain somewhere to the west. For the first time in weeks, I felt steady. They came together, which was new. Diane had always operated alone in her dealings with me, presenting a single, controlled front. Barbara I had seen only at rare family occasions, and even then she had maintained a careful peripheral distance, present but not quite engaging, like a figure in the background of a photograph. Seeing them side by side on my doorstep on a Saturday morning was, in itself, information. They were coordinating now. Diane was dressed neatly, as always. Barbara was in her late 70s, slender and angular, with the particular bearing of a woman who had once believed her life would go differently and had never entirely forgiven the world for it. She held a dish covered in foil, a quiche, as it turned out, from a bakery I recognized, the kind of detail designed to make everything seem neighborly and harmless, as though women who had spent 2 years trying to erase my name from a bank account could simply arrive with pastry and reset the terms of everything. I should have turned them away. I knew that even then, but I stepped back from the door and let them in because I wanted to hear what they had decided to say. Sometimes you need to let the other side show their hand. Sometimes the most useful thing you can do is stay quiet and listen. We sat at the kitchen table, the same table where I had sat surrounded by debt notices 5 years ago, where I had sat with my legal pad the morning Thomas Vale called. The table had seen a great deal. Barbara poured coffee. She simply got up and found the mugs and poured with the proprietary ease of someone reclaiming territory. She moved through my kitchen as though she had a right to it, opening the cabinet on the first try, knowing without asking where things were kept. Had Bob described this kitchen to her? Had they spoken about this house? My house, in ways I had never imagined. I noted that. I said nothing. Margaret, Diane began, we understand that you're upset. We understand that this situation looks a certain way from the outside. But there are things about your husband's finances that are more complicated than what you've been told. I'm sure there are, I said. Diane paused at my tone, recalibrated. The account at First Fidelity. That money had a specific purpose. My father set it aside years ago for reasons that were important to him. Family reasons. Before you. 2 words, carefully chosen. And yet, I said, my name was on it, as co-beneficiary, for 35 years. He was sentimental, Barbara said. Her voice was dry and precise. He added your name in a moment of sentiment. That doesn't mean the money was ever meant for you to simply take. I looked at her. I thought, you wrote to this man's bank, in his name, trying to erase me. And now you're sitting at his wife's kitchen table telling me his money was never meant for me. The audacity of it was almost architectural. It had structure. It had scale. It must have taken years to build. I see, I said. Diane leaned forward. Her hands were flat on the table, open, the posture of someone demonstrating honesty. We're prepared to be generous. We're not asking you to walk away with nothing. A settlement? You'd be comfortable. You wouldn't have to go through years of litigation. You wouldn't have to put Danny through that. There it was. Danny, again. The implication that this would somehow damage my son, spill over into his life, become his burden. They had mentioned Danny in the first phone call. They were mentioning him again now. It was not an accident. They had identified him as a pressure point, and they were pressing it with both hands, the way you press a bruise to see how much it still hurts. Danny knows I'm pursuing this, I said. Does he know all of it? Diane asked. Does he know the things my father told us about? She stopped, adjusted. About the state of your marriage in those final years? I felt the air in the kitchen change. What was she suggesting? What exactly was she willing to invent? What version of my marriage was she prepared to construct and present under oath, if it came to that? I felt anger move through me, clean and cold. Not the hot kind that makes you say things you regret, but the kind that focuses you down to a single point. Diane, I said very quietly, I want you to think carefully about what you are about to say, because anything you say to me, I will repeat under oath, and anything you cannot prove, you will be accountable for. The silence that followed lasted several seconds. Barbara set her coffee mug down with a small, hard sound. You are making a mistake, she said. You are an old woman living alone, and you have no idea what this family is capable of. I expect I'll find out, I said. You're welcome to leave the quiche. Diane stood. Her face had gone very still, the composure restored but thinner now, like paint over a crack. She looked at me with something I can only describe as assessment. The look of someone recalculating, deciding whether to change tactics or simply increase pressure. She chose neither. She walked to the front door, her mother behind her. Before she stepped outside, she turned back once. This is going to get worse before it gets better, she said. For which of us? I asked. She left without answering. I locked the door and stood in the hallway and breathed. My hands were steady, but my heart was moving quickly, that bright, specific fear that sharpens everything. What had Diane almost said? What was she willing to claim about Bob, about our marriage, about me? How far would two women go when they understood that losing meant losing everything they had spent years quietly, carefully arranging? I picked up my phone and called Carol. Then I called Ruth. Then I sat down at the kitchen table and wrote out everything they had said, word by word, while it was still fresh. Every inflection I could remember. Every pause. The way Barbara had poured the coffee. The way Diane's hands had been flat on the table. Fear, I had learned, was not the opposite of courage. It was the fuel. The deposition was scheduled for a Tuesday in late September at Carol's office in Blue Ash. I had been preparing for it for months. Not only legally, but in the way I used to prepare for the hardest parent-teacher conferences of my career. By knowing more than the other person expected me to know, and by keeping my face completely neutral when I used it. I had learned in 30 years of teaching that the most powerful position in any room is the one where you know exactly what is coming and the other person believes you don't. Carol had been thorough. Through the formal discovery process, she had obtained Gerald Pruitt's communications with Diane going back to 2016. Emails, not phone calls, because Pruitt had been careless in ways that careful people often are when they believe the other side isn't looking. The emails were not explicit. They never said, "Help us hide this account," or "keep the wife in the dark." But they established a pattern of contact between Pruitt and Diane during the estate proceedings that had not been disclosed to me, and they included one exchange dated 3 weeks before I signed the estate documents, in which Diane asked Pruitt to keep the first fidelity matter out of the summary she'll receive. And Pruitt had replied with 2 words, "Understood. Done." 2 words, 37 characters, the entire architecture of the last 5 years. I had read that email perhaps 40 times in the weeks before the deposition, not because I needed to memorize it. I had memorized it within the first reading. But because each time I read it, I felt something settle more firmly into place. 2 people had sat with the knowledge of what I was owed and had decided together that I should not have it. Not because I had done anything wrong, simply because they had decided that I did not matter enough to tell the truth to. The deposition room was a conference room with gray carpeting and a long table and water glasses that nobody touched. Carol sat beside me. Across the table were Diane, her attorney, a man named Stephen Breck, who had the look of someone accustomed to winning on paperwork. And beside him, a visibly aged Gerald Pruitt, who had lost weight and whose hands, I noticed, were not quite still. Barbara was not there. She had submitted a written statement through Breck. She had, it seemed, decided to maintain distance. That, too, was information. When the pressure becomes real, you find out quickly who trusts whom and how much. Diane looked composed when she came in. She was dressed professionally, her posture correct, her expression arranged in the serene certainty of someone who has been told by their attorney that everything is under control. Carol opened by introducing the first Fidelity Trust documentation. The account history, the co-beneficiary designation, the balance at the time of Bob's death. Then she introduced the letter, the original inquiry letter submitted to First Fidelity in September 2017, asking about the removal of a co-beneficiary. She placed a copy in front of Diane and asked her to look at it. Diane looked at it. "Can you identify the handwriting in this letter?" Carol asked. "I can't say for certain," Diane said. "Take your time." "I really can't say." Carol then produced a comparison document, a card Diane had sent me at Christmas 2018, which I had provided with Diane's handwriting. She placed it beside the letter. The room was very quiet. Stephen Breck said something about the reliability of handwriting comparison, and Carol acknowledged it smoothly and said that the documents had been reviewed by a certified forensic document examiner retained by our side, and that she would be submitting the expert's report as an exhibit. Diane's composure did not break, but something behind it shifted. Something in the set of her jaw, the small adjustment of her eyes. She had walked into this room believing she could hold the line of, "I don't recall." She was beginning to understand that the line had already been cut from behind. "Ms. Harlow Cross," Carol said, "were you aware of the First Fidelity Trust account during your father's lifetime?" "My father discussed various financial matters with me, yes." "Were you aware of the account at the time of your father's death?" "I was aware that he had various accounts." "Were you aware of this specific account when you participated in discussions with Gerald Pruitt regarding the estate settlement?" A pause. Breck leaned over and said something quietly. Diane said, "I don't recall the specific details of every account discussed." Carol let the silence sit for 3 seconds. Then she placed the email exchange in front of Pruitt. Pruitt stared at it. He looked, for a moment, like a man watching a wall he had built very carefully simply fall. His hands on the table were still now, with the particular stillness of someone who has stopped trying to control their composure and moved into something beyond it. Carol addressed him directly. "Mr. Pruitt, this email, dated October 14th, 2019, contains your written response to a request from Diane Harlow Cross to exclude, and I'm quoting, the First Fidelity matter from documentation provided to Margaret Harlow during estate proceedings. Your response was, 'Understood. Done.' Is this your email address in the header?" Breck objected. "It was overruled. This was a deposition." "Yes," Pruitt said. His voice was barely audible. "Is this your reply?" A longer pause. In the silence, I could hear the faint sound of traffic from the street outside, ordinary life continuing in its ordinary way, indifferent to what was being confirmed in this gray-carpeted room. "Yes." The word landed in the room like something dropped from a height. Diane turned to look at Pruitt. It was an involuntary movement. She couldn't help it. And in it, I saw everything. The recognition that he had just confirmed what they had both agreed not to confirm. That the careful architecture of "I don't recall" and various accounts had just been structurally undermined by a 2-word email reply a tired attorney had sent 3 years ago and forgotten about. The look she gave him lasted less than 2 seconds. But it contained, in that brief flash, something very close to fury. I kept my face still. I thought about the kitchen floor where I had sat after Thomas Vale called, the soup cans, the legal pad, the 5 years of quiet, grinding diminishment. I thought, here we are. The deposition was the beginning of the end, not the end itself. Legal proceedings moved slowly, and the months that followed required patience I didn't always have. There were motions filed and countered, additional discovery requests, a mediation session in January that lasted 6 hours and resolved nothing because Diane's team still believed they had enough uncertainty to work with. They didn't. But they needed to arrive at that conclusion themselves, and no amount of evidence, it turned out, accelerates the speed at which a person accepts that they have lost. The moment they arrived was a Thursday in March, almost a full year after Thomas Vale's phone call, when Stephen Breck contacted Carol and said his client was prepared to discuss settlement. Carol called me that afternoon. I was in the park, on the bench near the duck pond where I had sat so many times in the past year, working things through. The sky was flat and gray, and the ducks were moving in their indifferent circles, and my phone rang. "They want to talk," Carol said. "What changed?" I asked. "The Board of Professional Conduct issued its preliminary findings on Pruitt this morning. He's facing disbarment. His attorney has advised him to cooperate with us fully in exchange for consideration on the civil claims. He's prepared to provide a complete sworn statement." That was what had changed. When Gerald Pruitt decided that protecting Diane was no longer worth the destruction of his own career and reputation, the entire structure they had built collapsed. It had always depended on his silence. The moment he chose otherwise, there was nothing left to hold it up. A conspiracy is only as strong as the willingness of its participants to keep paying the cost. And for Pruitt, the cost had finally exceeded what he was prepared to pay. We did not settle. I want to be clear about that. Stephen Breck proposed settlement 3 times over the following 6 weeks, and 3 times Carol and I declined. Not out of cruelty. Out of the simple calculation that what a court would award us given Pruitt's forthcoming testimony and the documentary evidence we had assembled was substantially more than anything Diane was willing to offer voluntarily. She was still, even then, trying to limit the damage. She was still, even at that stage, trying to control what the outcome looked like. I had spent 5 years having things controlled for me. I was done with that. The case went before a judge in Hamilton County in April. It was not a long trial. Complex cases sometimes aren't when the documentary record is complete. The forensic examiner confirmed the handwriting. Pruitt testified under oath that Diane had known about the First Fidelity account before Bob's death and had instructed him to exclude it from estate documentation. He testified that Barbara had been present at least one conversation where the account's concealment was discussed. He testified that he had complied, that he had rationalized it as serving his longtime client's wishes, and that he understood now the harm it had caused. He looked at me once while he said this. His face had the gray, collapsed look of a man who had rehearsed a version of himself for decades and was finally watching it disassemble in public. I felt no particular satisfaction in it. What I felt was more like recognition, the acknowledgement of a truth that had existed all along, finally said aloud in a room that would record it. I didn't look away. Diane sat at the respondents' table throughout with the rigid stillness of someone using every available unit of self-control. She did not testify in her own defense in any meaningful way. Breck had clearly advised her against it, knowing that Carol's cross-examination would be methodical and that Diane's habit of careful misdirection would not hold up under sustained direct questioning. She said very little. For a woman who had spent years managing information, managing perception, managing what I knew and what I didn't, the silence must have cost her considerably. The judge ruled in my favor on all primary claims. The full balance of the First Fidelity account, which I will now tell you, was $2.3 million, accumulated over 40 years of quiet, steady deposits by a man who had, whatever his failings in speech, kept his promise in writing, was awarded to me as the lawful co-beneficiary. The estate debt was legally recategorized, and a portion was determined to have been improperly attributed to the marital estate. I was awarded damages for this as well. In total, the judgment came to just over $2.6 million. Diane was ordered to pay legal fees. Gerald Pruitt was separately liable for damages related to his professional negligence and was formally referred to the bar for disciplinary proceedings. The Ohio Supreme Court's Board of Professional Conduct, acting on the complaint Carol had filed the previous spring, revoked his license to practice law 4 months after the judgment. Barbara issued no public statement. She had, throughout the trial, maintained a silence that was either strategic or simply the retreat of someone who had finally understood the full weight of what had been done. I did not know which. I did not go looking for the answer. Diane appealed. Her attorney filed the appeal in May, and the appellate court denied it in August. I was notified by Carol on a Tuesday morning. I was at home, drinking coffee at the kitchen table, the same table where all of this had begun. And when she told me the denial had come through and the judgment was final and unappealable, I said thank you and hung up. and sat very still for a long moment. The kitchen was quiet. The morning light came through the curtains the same way it always had. Nothing looked different, and everything was. Then I called Danny. I called Ruth. I called my sister in Portland. Each call was short. There were no dramatic speeches, no lengthy declarations. Just the same 3 words, spoken 3 times. It's over. We won. The money was transferred to my account in September. I remember the moment the confirmation email arrived. An ordinary-looking email. Standard bank formatting, sitting in my inbox between a grocery store promotion and a note from the library about a book on hold. I printed it. I folded it carefully and put it in the same folder where I had kept, for a year, every document, every note, every photograph of every piece of evidence that had brought me to this place. Then I went to Graeter's. Single scoop, black raspberry chip. I sat by the window and watched the street and didn't think about anything in particular. It was enough. I did not leave Cincinnati. People assumed I would. That the first thing I'd do with the money would be to sell the house on Westover Hills Boulevard and move somewhere warm and far away, to start clean. But I had lived in that city for 40 years, and I had walked out of that house every morning through the worst of everything, and I wasn't going to let anyone take it from me, not even by moving. What I did was fix the roof, which had needed it for 3 years. Then I repaid the debts. All of them, in full, in a single afternoon, sitting at my computer with a cup of tea, paying off account after account, with the concentrated pleasure of someone finally setting down a very heavy bag. The second mortgage, the line of credit, the medical bills. Numbers that had lived in my head like a low, persistent noise for 5 years. And then they were gone. The silence afterward was remarkable. In the spring, I sold the house. Not in retreat, but because I found something I loved more. A craftsman bungalow 3 miles away in Oakley, closer to Ruth. 2 blocks from the coffee shop where we'd had our Thursday morning conversations all through the previous year. It had original hardwood floors and a front porch with 2 chairs and a garden in the back that had been left to grow wild. I spent that first summer putting it in order. Tomatoes, zucchini, black-eyed Susans along the fence line. The physical work of it was a pleasure I hadn't expected. Danny and his wife came for a long weekend in July. My granddaughter, who was 4, helped me water the garden and announced with great authority that the tomatoes were not ready yet. I took her to the duck pond. She named all of the ducks. She named them things like Gerald and Patricia and Soup, which made me laugh in a way I hadn't laughed in a very long time. I began to volunteer again, at the elementary school 6 blocks from my new house, tutoring reading twice a week, sitting across from a 7-year-old who is sounding out a word for the first time, watching the moment they get it. There is nothing quite like that. I had missed it. I hadn't known how much until I walked back into that room. Ruth and I joined a book club that met on the first Wednesday of every month at a wine bar on Hyde Park Square. The books were sometimes excellent and sometimes terrible, and the discussion was frequently more about the members' lives than the actual text, which was, I decided, exactly as it should be. I thought about Bob. I would be lying if I said otherwise. I thought about him often, not with the raw grief of the first years, but with something more complex, more textured. I had loved him. I believed in the part of me that had known him longest, that he had loved me. The account was real. His intention, whatever its complications, had been real. He had added my name in 1989 and had kept it there through everything. And I thought sometimes that this was the most honest thing he had ever told me, that he had said it not in words but in paperwork, quietly and without ceremony. the way he had done most things. I didn't forgive him entirely for the silence, but I understood it better as time went on. As for Diane and Barbara, I did not follow their lives with any satisfaction. But facts are facts, and this is what reached me in the ordinary way that news travels in a city where people know each other. Diane's real estate business in Louisville had been struggling before the trial. The legal fees, substantial given the length of the proceedings, had compounded problems that already existed. She sold her house in the Highlands neighborhood in November of that year, and a mutual acquaintance mentioned, without particular emphasis, that she had moved into a smaller rental. Whether the business had fully closed or simply contracted, I didn't know and didn't ask. Barbara had a health episode in the winter, a fall at home, a fracture that required recovery in a rehabilitation facility. She had no husband, limited income, and Diane, as far as anyone could tell, was in no position to be a reliable source of support. It was, I thought, a hard way to spend your late 70s. I didn't feel triumphant about it. I felt, if I'm honest, something closer to sad. Life had given them choices. They had chosen poorly, and in the end the ledger balanced itself, the way ledgers generally do. Not dramatically, not with fanfare, but with the quiet and merciless arithmetic of consequence. Gerald Pruitt moved to Florida, his license revoked, his reputation in Cincinnati reduced to a cautionary anecdote told in legal circles. I did not think about them often. There was too much living to do. My name is Peggy Harlow, and for 5 years I believed the story I had been handed. Then I stopped believing it, and everything changed. What I learned: trust your instincts when something feels wrong. Get your own attorney. Read every document before you sign it. And never, ever let anyone convince you that the truth is too complicated for you to understand. You are capable of more than they think. I was. So, what would you have done? If this story moved you, please share it. Leave a comment. And thank you, sincerely, for listening all the way to the end.